welcome everyone to Purple Cloud Summit and Lounge for our second session of the day. One I am incredibly stoked to have some brilliant minds that are going to come up. I'll introduce them. My name is Luke. For those that weren't here for our morning session or for here in person, I head up marketing at Lightspan, and we're very pleased to have you with our co-title sponsor at Perimeter 81. So speaking of Perimeter 81, I have the pleasure to introduce your moderator for the panel, Gilly Netzer. She's going to come on. Everyone else come up after her and give a round of applause, please, for our second panel.
Thank you. Come on out. Hello. Hi, everybody. All right, thank you for coming back. So I'm Gilly Netzer, I'm VP Marketing with Perimeter 81. It's actually a very exciting week for us. We just announced a couple of days ago our C funding round, and with a valuation of $1 billion. So we're very busy this week. Yeah, thank you. I'm very excited to be here at RSA face-to-face with so many people after COVID. You know, it's really, it feels like a different experience after so much time working from remote. And I have my friends here. Will you want to introduce yourself, please? Steve?
Sure. Hey, everybody. It's great to be here in person. So my name's Steve Pugh. I'm the CISO for Intercontinental Exchange, which is a parent company of New York Stock Exchange.
My name is Ugo Chukwuenyoha. I'm a VP of Security Engineering at Cloudflare.
I'm Joe Vatican. I'm the EVP for Sales and Engineering for Lightstream, which is a security organization.
Hi, all. Good to be here. I'm Srinath. I lead cloud security for Netflix.
All right. So we're going to do some questions here today and get some insights and advices from these professionals. And we'll do some Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions. Okay, so the first question, maybe, Ugo, we can start with you. With the momentum towards shifting security left, what are you seeing when it comes to developers carrying more responsibility for security? Is there friction between security teams? And if so, how would you suggest to avoid it?
Okay. So first of all, this is a fantastic question. It's something that I've had to ponder year over year as I've worked building out security programs. I'm going to go way back and talk about, give a little story about a company I worked with back in the day. And the experiences they had when they were actually trying to do what we today call DevSecOps, right? So back in the day, they were trying to actually roll out this tool and then put it in front of their developers and try to find all different kinds of security risk. And what they realized was that those developers didn't care. They didn't take those tools. They didn't use them. They didn't deploy them. And they documented their experiences, and they have this really lovely quote that they brought out of it, and they mentioned, you would think that developers, and I'm paraphrasing here, you would think that developers would care about the fact that we're finding all sorts of risk and presenting it to them, but they're not motivated, right? And a lot of the challenge seems to be in the quality of the tools that we've put in front of them, right? That we need to think beyond those tools. Our responsibility is actually advanced beyond those tools if we really want to get developers to care about, the ability to find risk. Funny enough, then, a week ago, I saw on developer Twitter. There is a thing called developer Twitter, a bunch of people who are actually railing about this whole concept of shift left. Why are you putting all this stuff on me? Why are you putting all this stuff on me to fix? And I think for me, what I realized there, right, even from that situation back in the day, was we need to have a lot of developer empathy to manage this issue of friction, right? It can really fuel the curiosity you need so that when you build these tools, you think about not just how they should function from a security perspective, but how they integrate into the developer workflows, right? How they present the information to the developer so that it's actionable. Things like false positives rates matter. Utility of the tools matter. And that's how you actually manage the friction, right? With really a significant amount of developer empathy and curiosity.
Okay, thank you. I really like to hear someone, coming from the security, being empathic to the situation and understanding that this is really needed. And I've seen you, Srinath, nodding, so maybe you want to add.
Yeah, this is definitely top of mind, and the story that Ugo said definitely resonates well with me as well. I think for security to get it right, it's a joint partnership with developers. And as a result, I have seen what really works is giving plenty of context on every little finding that we're going to throw out and every little action that we want developers to take. And that context could be like showing an attack path or being able to say, hey, this is an ELB that runs in this particular environment, and you would need resolution because, and this is the criticality of that. So given plenty of context, that drives good action. So I really like that context and providing extra context to developers. They do care, and I also think security is just one other form of quality, right? And if developers are responsible for quality of their software, then they should also care about security, right? So, and that's where approaching with empathy is always a great win for both worlds.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a very good point, for any kind of collaboration, sharing more information, getting the buy-in through understanding is very important. Joe?
Yeah, even from my perspective, like working with Fortune 2000, good 80% of them, has been just around what Sri said and Hugo said. The reality is, like he said, context, right? A lot of the developers don't have the context behind why they're doing it. So educating some of these developers on security and shifting towards the left, and really talking about what kind of impact is it going to make if they don't have that part of the quality of the software development life cycle. It's really important. And I think there was a statistics that just came out early this year that 50% of the developers don't build a secure software. And that's because, it's not because they don't want to, it's just they don't know how to. Like I've even seen one major organization was pushing their code out and it had secrets all over, hard-coded account information, I mean, all kinds of stuff, right? And this is like a well-established organization, right? But the reality is, with all the mass migration going on, with people are moving from various different shops. If you don't have guardrails, if you don't have education kind of built into your software organization, it's going to become very harder to maintain and build that consistency.
Thank you. So Steve, how often do you see this kind of friction, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as the panel has already said, I agree with a lot of those points. And I think it really goes back to that empathy piece. And I think if you're not willing to go have the conversations, to have an understanding of the developers, you're going to get friction left and right because you just fundamentally don't understand where they're coming from. And oftentimes in security, we talk about technology because it's really cool, but it may not be solving the right problems. And so it kind of reminds me, back in college, you'd write some code, it would compile, you'd turn it in, get a bad grade, and you're like, what the heck? The professor's like, well, it compiles, but it doesn't run, right? And so we had this shift where instead of having armies of QA teams, it was like, hey, developer, now you have test-driven development. Like, you need to own the quality of the code. And I also think, to Hugo's point, it's like, I think we're at a point now where we have technology to really empower developers from a security mindset. And so much the same way of the QA trajectory, I think security is now at a point where we can educate developers, teach them how to write better code. Because I fundamentally think that developers want to write quality, secure code. It's just that it's hard, and we haven't had the good tools to be able to do that. And I think now we do. And so coupling the empathy, the conversations, and really partnering with developers, I think it reduces a lot of the friction.
Okay.
But if you just go in with a security mindset and you're like, this is my way, it's never going to work. You'll end up with lots of friction and pushback.
Totally agree. Great, so that leads us to the next question. Maybe you want to take it, Srinath. So what are the biggest collaboration opportunities that you see between IT and security leaders?
Yeah, it's one of those things that is fresh on our mind as well, because IT at Netflix was included in the information security organization very recently, about 3 years ago. And since that has happened, I have seen a lot of very nice collaboration between IT teams and security on various fronts. So I would say things like asset inventory, incident response, and vendor reviews, reducing risk from contractor access, right? So those are all the areas that we have seen a lot of momentum where, hey, I like configuration, I like to make sure that our software and devices are up to date and those kind of things, but are there security benefits? So let's partner up and then throw that out there so that we can at least help each other, right? So that has been very, very important. I also think we currently, as we speak, we have a lot of joint projects that are in works. things like endpoint management, Active Directory, right? So there are a lot of touch points where if you say, oh, IT is somewhere out there, they keep doing their thing, and security is somewhere out here, they keep doing their thing, then I think we will probably be pulling the cart in two different directions. So I think partnering up is a way to kind of get them together, work together, so that we can pull the cart in the right direction, or in one direction at least. Right or wrong, it depends on the enterprise, of course.
Okay, thank you. So, Joe, from your perspective as an MSSP at Lightstream, how does that work?
Yeah, so for us, it's all about educating CISOs to work with CIOs much closer because cybersecurity is one of those segments where they chase technology. As in, every time there's a new technology comes up, cybersecurity comes right behind it to protect, detect, visibility, observability, and try to wrap something around it. And for that to work properly, they need, CISOs have to get into a deeper conversation with the CIOs, with the app developers, and so forth, right? And like the app team and so forth, the product teams. We are seeing more and more today. It's in the Fortune 2000, it's a little bit, it's all over the map, right? Every enterprise organization is sort of like a snowflake in most instances. In the mid-market space, which creates 3 of the 4 jobs in the United States, it's a big problem because they have 5 people in IT security, and then they have smaller wallet share because they can only spend so much. So it's us as an MSSP, we try to educate how to provide that and bridge that gap between the CISO and the CIO, or it would be one of the same person, right? But they don't have the full exposure into it. So we are always, it's a struggle, but we can only scale so much, just like any other organization. But more and more, if you have those kind of conversations, it just makes it easier.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, Ugo, I wanted to ask you in that context, we were talking about tools, right? And the tools are an enabler. So talking about automation, how does that work for the collaboration between the teams for you?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I love to tell stories about the experiences that I've had dealing with this. So first of all, there's a lot of thematic opportunity, right? If you step back and you're interacting with all these teams, especially the IT teams, right? You'll probably see a couple of themes where you could piggyback on some of the work they're doing and slipstream some security controls. So asset management is fantastic. Observability as a general topic, right, is something that these teams care about. We're moving the cloud, we want to do cost optimization, we want to leave that server hanging around forever. So they will probably think about cost optimization. There are tools you can bring in there. One area that I found particularly effective in my previous role was reference architecture and guardrails, right? So the organization was trying to standardize how do the developers build their services to follow a particular pattern. And they started to actually build these templating engines. And we worked alongside them, and then we figured out that, hey, we could introduce some security controls into those templating engines so that those, when you create a service, it's secure by default. And now the work is just to maintain that security posture over time. So there's a lot of opportunity where you can, take a look at the tools that the IT organization is trying to do, or, the developer organization is trying to do, and then figure out, okay, how do I actually help them there and have compounding benefits, which is ultimately what we're looking for.
Thank you. So, Steve, how would you coach a new CISO or a cloud security leader in navigating the internal culture and the best practice? Any framework for success from your end?
Yeah, this is I think it's something that a lot of younger security folks struggle with, but I think it really comes down to communication. And as you think about the core competencies of being a security expert, generally like the softer skills of communication, the empathy, building relationships aren't what you start with. And so that's generally the first thing I start with is communication. And so for a new CISO or new cloud person, it's really about understanding the problem, which again ties back to that empathy piece. And I think, most of the folks here have deep security expertise, and I think given a problem in the right context and with the right understanding, we could probably come up with a pretty elegant solution that everybody can agree on and get a win-win. But I find we oftentimes struggle when we just come up with these solutions, as I said before, and just try to put them on people. And then, of course, you're going to get pushback. And so the communication's the first part to start. And then after that, it's really just about leveraging the technology. And then I think the other piece, too, is I try to align with the security transparency, meaning the things that we do today in security is not like a dark art. It's not black magic. There's no, secret sauce, really. And so being able to talk about what we're doing and why helps. But the other piece too, and I think Hugo alluded to this, is that if you're doing the right things as a developer, the security should not even be in your presence. Like it should be the sort of the bumpers when you're bowling. Only when you go towards the gutters do you ever really interact with security, because we want to enable the company to go fast, but do so in a risk-controlled way. So those are kind of the two places where I would start for a new person.
Okay, makes sense. Joe?
Yeah, so like Steve mentioned, right, communication, open communication, and having that broader discussion upfront. Tools, like even from my perspective, like when prior to Lightstream, I was at Optiv and stuff. So we had like a full breadth of 500 different products and capabilities. And some of the struggles were like also, organizations just buying tools and just throwing over the fence and operationalizing it 20%, never getting the full length of the features and capabilities that is required to build that outcome. And for that to happen, there needs to be a broader conversation between the organizations in a way that, like Steve was mentioning, building an elegant solution, right? And that all starts with conversation. And without that, it's a chaos out there, right? And people need to take a step back on most of these conversations and really bring clarity to that chaos. And the only way that's going to happen is through communication.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we talk a lot about communication, about technology, enablers, to bring together the teams. I don't know, Srinath, maybe you have like maybe a more tactical advice on, how to deal with that communication. What do you do, for that?
Yeah, so I can add to that on the communication front specifically, right? So I think in order to communicate effectively, you should be a good listener. And that's why I would say if you're a new CISO, the first 90 days is all about listening. Listen, 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 assess your gaps, assess historical friction with stakeholders, and also understand what your threats versus capability gap looks like. And that is going to help inform choices, and that is going to help you communicate with plenty of context. And I also, one thing that I would like to throw out there is going in line with the culture. As you all know, Netflix has a very strong culture, and going against the culture is not going to drive any good actions, right? So that's why it's important to stay aligned. Any tools, any processes, anything that you're going to build, if it's in alignment with the culture, then it resonates well with everybody, not just developers, like even security people, auditors, everybody who works at the organization. And that is going to, again, pull the cart in the same direction that the organization is going.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Thank you.
I would just add one thing
Yeah.
on the communication tactically. I'm always amazed at how, I'll see a problem, I'll talk to the team and say, what's going on here? Like, what's the deal? And they're like, well, we sent an email. And, right? And it's like, man, if you would just pick up the phone. And I think it was like even more apparent to me through COVID because we relied on all these, digital technologies and Slacks, and like Zoom approximates it maybe, like, that kind of stuff. But going to somebody's office, like if you can do that, it's a way different experience. But just like the simple act of picking up the phone and having a conversation, I'm amazed that like such a simple thing has such a meaningful impact on like solving problems. So I don't think you can underestimate sort of the basics.
Yes, totally. I think it's also about, generation, right? We see the young generations, they're so much into the digital, the Slack, the WhatsApps, the email, and forget all about, actually having relationships with people and going back to an RSA opportunity like this, looking people in the eye, talking to them is all about really, communication, relationships, and that's really what creates all the fast forward of this world, at least in my perspective. So I
joke
agree.
saying we are becoming a Slack generation in a slacking way.
Okay, so let's zoom out a little bit and talk about trends and board level executives. So with that, Srinath, what are some trends you see in cloud security that are most important for leaders to track, no matter what is the company size?
So I think before we talk about trends, we should acknowledge the basics, right? So basics are important, and things like vulnerability management, asset inventory, and misconfiguration detection and remediation. and just having logs and incident response. Those are the basics. And once you have those, I think if I look at the cloud security space holistically in the past 5 years or so, there are some new trends that I think it's worth paying attention to. I can think about three things top of mind. Immutable infrastructure as code, shift left scans to find vulnerable configurations before they happen is one trend that is taking off. And also adding a lot of risk reducing benefits, right? It's not because it's a cool buzzword. I also think data perimeters is another one that is also important. It is getting a lot of attention, and it's resonating well with practitioners. Being able to draw a boundary around your data where your walled garden resides and what everything you should care about and what you shouldn't care about. That is also important, and I think the cloud service providers can do a lot in kind of giving us the nuts and bolts for configuring data perimeters. So it's an emerging field that's worth paying attention to. One last thing I also think about is Netflix we have lean teams with huge charters. So the way we dig ourselves out of that problem is strategically investing on automation capabilities to scale ourselves. So things like attribute-based access control is one thing that my team is heavily working on right now to scale ourselves from identity and access management permissions, so that we don't have to linearly grow my teams as the organization grows. So can we just set up a few policies, and that is going to have all the bells and whistles, and then the organization scales by itself. So you're just decoupling the two. I would say those three trends comes to my mind.
Wow, actually 3, but a lot. I'm seeing also some trends, with cloud and 5G and fiber, and internet being the new perimeter of all the companies. I want to ask you, Ugo, about zero trust approach and about the trend of how you need to keep the security posture optimal.
I wonder, why do we call it zero trust? Why don't we call it something new, like dynamic access and authorization management?
Context-based, context-aware.
Yes. You see, this is why I don't work for Gartner. Right. Now, you're absolutely right. What cloud's doing, and we see this a lot at Cloudflare. I mean, in fact, it's powering like a whole new stream of our business. But we see this, this realization for many companies, especially with the pandemic, that with everyone working at home, and if you had the traditional organization where you had like a data center, you don't have that luxury anymore of funneling all the traffic through your choke points, right? People need to be able to, for example, connect to their SaaS applications. So that whole internet perimeter has changed. It's no longer a situation where you have that moat and castle, right? So now what does it mean in this new world to protect, your customers, to protect your partners, to protect your users, right? It's now this whole new word that also Gartner's brought in called SASE, right? Which is secure access service edge. And it's about introducing these newer style firewalls that are more dynamic in nature. It's about introducing endpoint security, zero trust network access, zero trust on the application, secure web gateways, right? I like to think about it that this is the new reference architecture as a result of cloud, right? How we are going to start thinking about protecting users versus protecting the network only, right? And it's very interesting, right? Because it's definitely going to be if you ask me, it's definitely going to be maybe the next 10 years of investment here. You will see lots of companies come and succeed, and obviously others will struggle to try and figure this out. But it's nice to see that Cloudflare has a really, really effective solution, and we're already using that with customers.
Okay, thanks. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, what Hugo said, right? Zero trust has been quite a buzzword for the last 5 years, but it's really a journey, right? Because there's so many components to it. There's identity, there's SASE, there's endpoint, and then there's cloud, right? And all of those things to integrate and go through that journey to get to that transformation is going to take a long time. That's the reality of things. Yeah, I know in this business we have zero trust on every single vaporware products to good products, right? But like I said, from a trend perspective, what I see all the time is, especially in the cloud security, CSPs are developing more and more tool set for visibility and observability and so forth. And then there's CWPP, CSPM, CNAP. There's all these buzzwords that from Gartner, thankfully for creating categories to keep up with it. But the product has evolved so much, right? I mean, it started several years ago, just getting visibility around it, and now we are at a point where we can actually take actionable intelligence to make a decision out of it. And now it's also about people understanding what to do with it. That's a whole other issue that we have in general. And like I said in my initial answer in the beginning, operationalization is still a major problem. And some of the basic hygiene, we just don't have the right discipline in resources and executing against it. That every organization that I've interacted with has gone through this motion about rip and replace. And that, since we also gone through the pay-as-you-go model and SaaS and so forth, people feel like it's very easy to do that, but it's actually breaking things more than fixing things. So, look, time is finite, and we got to fix a lot of problems, and cybersecurity is a major problem right now. So, and there's only so many people out there. So automation, operationalization, basic hygiene, those are very important for all of this cybersecurity to work properly.
We've not even talked about interop, but we'll get there.
Yeah, no doubt.
Maybe we can coin another buzzword right here, DAM, Dynamic Access Management.
Yeah, that's me. Call it DAM. Don't call it Zero Trust. Tell Gartner I said so.
Which started here.
Remember that. Okay, so Steve, we're talking about all different trends. Security is kind of playing catch up with the digital transformation. And with regards to this, what are some of the best practices that executives, when communicating to the board and to the executive management, what are the best practices in terms of cloud, risk, and governance? Maybe you can give some examples.
Yeah, sure, happy to. So, it kind of occurs to me a couple years ago, everybody was talking about the shared security model. Like it was this new thing that, just because I went to the cloud didn't mean your security team didn't have anything to do anymore. And so I think we've gotten to a good place now where we're starting to understand what the architecture looks like in the cloud and sort of the obligations as a security team. And so now that we're at this point, we're sort of like maturing. Now it's about the automation of that. And so hiring's always been tough. And so to the extent that you can automate, get the right level of visibility, I think is really important. And once you get that level of visibility, then it's about the prioritization. Like, how do I actively manage this risk? And so when I talk to the board, generally they're not, super deep technically. I try to talk about risk in two veins. The first is, do I have the right level of visibility of risk across the organization? And so, that could be like a cloud posture security management piece. And if I'm confident going in and saying, yes, we have the right level of visibility, then it's like, do we have the optimal level of control of that risk? Because just because you can see all the rats in the basement, as Chris Inglis said the other night, doesn't mean that the rats are going away. You have to do something about them. And so those are kind of the two ways that I talk to the board about the risk. And so as we move to the cloud, I think we've done a pretty good job of automating around the infrastructure piece. I think we're starting to see trends towards containers. But I also think there's like this higher level piece about the SaaS applications. Mm-hmm. And so you have a bunch of interconnects, a bunch of, if you take a standard Slack environment, the amount of plugins and connections and everything, those are all API keys. And, I question, who's going through making sure those are least privilege access, which is sort of one of the key tenets to Zero Trust. And I think it's a pretty exponential problem just because of the pervasiveness and how easy it is to use SaaS applications. So I think those are some of the things that I talk to the board about, but largely goes back to just the visibility piece, how I'm doing there, and then do I have the right level of control?
Yeah, so visibility, control, continuous monitoring, right? Anyone wants to add?
Yeah, I just want to plus one the risk-based context sharing with the board, because I think the boards understand risks to business rather than security concepts. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to meet them where they are and then tell them, hey, this is a risk to the business. And we go a step further at Netflix. We actually quantify that with dollar amount. This is a $200 million risk. Exfiltration from S3 buckets is a $200 million risk. And that is why we have automation, and that is why we have these controls in place. So everybody understands dollars, everybody cares about it, right? So essentially and kind of communicating it that way resonates well with the board. Mm-hmm. I also think it's important to highlight the wins. And one other thing I also want to quickly throw out there is I've seen regularly people use frameworks like NIST, CSF, and others to communicate to the board. Mm-hmm. I'm not a big fan of those because you miss out on a lot of context around it. To give you an example, right? It asks you a question. Hey, do you use security groups for granular access control on the network side? Yes or no? Okay, you get a score for that. But if you already have mutual TLS, you probably don't need that, or maybe you need that as a defense in depth. So you can give that entire context on what kind of attacks you're trying to prevent, and then that is going to help move away from these frameworks for the sake of frameworks and communicate that with plenty of context to the board. And that is helpful.
Okay, good. So Ugo, how often do you communicate to the C-suite, and what is your advice?
So this is where I'll expose a little bit of my ignorance. I've been at Cloudflare now 4 months. I expect to have a conversation in probably the next 2. But to the larger question about board conversations, right? I like to think about it too as scenarios, right? There are a couple of questions I always think are interesting if you can explain to the board. One would be, tell me about a situation where you've had a near miss, right, or a low severity issue, out of luck, right? Tell the board about that and the factors that made it a low severity issue, because you don't know. Sometimes your low severity issue could just be because it happened at the time when someone was vigilant. And then you can now talk about, okay, well, these are the things that we're going to do to make it, not just by fortune that we ran into it. You see what I mean? Right? It's a very useful conversation you can have with the board. I mean, there are other things you can talk about. Tell me about, a plausible scenario, right, that stresses you out. Right, and that's where a solution like Lightspin could be useful, right? Because you can now start taking all that data you're gathering, and you come back with an attack graph and say, look, here's a plausible scenario right now that we can't sustainably resolve, and here are the next things that we want to do, right, to actually manage that down, right? So it kind of weaves all. You see, when you answer that kind of question, you're forcing yourself and the org to weave all that narrative that you're pulling from all your different data sources.
Yep.
Right.
I like that approach of, starting with the question of, what is your pain point, what is bothering you, and then going from there.
Correct, and you can now come back with a story. And I always say that security teams, the best thing we can do for ourselves long term is tell stories about risk, right? Not just present risks as a line item to fix. Tell stories about risk with all the data we've gathered.
Okay, great.
So therapy session with the board?
Yeah, totally, totally. Okay, so Joe, if you could fix one thing in cloud security, and that will be our last question to conclude this panel, what would it be?
Yeah, so fix one thing in cloud security, I would say operationalize, right? Operationalize your tool sets that you already have. And whether you use OSS or if you're using Lightspin, which has tremendous capabilities like Ugo mentioned, right? The attack graph, you get a visual representation of what's going on. So those things, operationalization is the key aspect of anything you're going to do in cybersecurity.
Okay, Steve?
Yeah, well, actually, the one thing I would say is my old boss when I was at Twilio is Khozema, and whenever we would have, I call it story time with Steve, he would always ask, he's like, are we good or do we get lucky? That's a tough question to answer, but I think it's an important thought exercise for incidents you go into. But back to your question, I think really just getting your arms around the SaaS applications that you have in your environment, getting the right level of control and visibility and permissions, because I think that could be a wildfire pretty quickly.
Okay, Hugo, fix one thing in cloud.
Oh man, there's so many things we need to fix.
Just one.
I'm not going to focus specifically on cloud, but I'd say I'd love to see more interop between all the tools that we have, because the ability to tell these stories about risk right now is painful. If all of you sit down today and say, hey, I want to go weave this narrative about how we could get hacked because of this vulnerability and that vulnerability, right? And you probably discovered it through maybe your threat modeling process, your tooling process. It's hard. You got to put it all in your head. So I would love to see what we can do to make that easier.
For sure, there are dozens solutions that every company just employs, and it's very difficult to, control and monitor all that.
Yeah, we should just impose the schema on all of you.
Yeah.
And to add to that, we are also starting to see like new set of tools coming out in cyber collaboration space, because that is a real problem, right? And data analytics and tying and stitching it together and doing correlation against it to see what is the effectiveness to manage that risk from a multi-product perspective. The reality is in typical enterprise, there's 60, 70 different security tool sets. It's not one thing, right? So
Yeah.
it's a very complex problem.
Yeah, and I would add to that, really the need not just to consolidate or find a way to manage it all is really simplicity, right? So for me, simplicity equals security. If it's not simple, they won't deploy it. It's like everyone is up to here with solutions and things to do and alerts. And so for me, simplicity is really key. Srinath, anything?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. For me, cloud service providers should stop charging for security services. Because if it's job number 0, then I don't think it should be a nice to have, right? So by charging them, you're essentially saying, hey, pay for it if you can afford it, if you have the budget for it. So you're treating security as a nice to have, but security is a must have, right? So maybe I'm drinking the Kool-Aid, I'm in it all the time, but I do think it should be free of charge.
This is like the new SSO tax call out.
Yeah. You need to name and shame. You need to start naming.
He's got a point. I mean, you can't sell a car without car seatbelt, right? So I think we should have something like that.
I also add one more thing. I think there is room for more user abstractions. I think cloud services are really hard to use. Can we make it really simple? Can somebody say something in plain English? Can that translate everything into configurations and just make that problem go away? It makes it easier to manage cloud and provisioning and resource management and all that, especially at scale.
Sounds good.
I would say ABAC too. Just a +1, what you were saying earlier. I think attribute-based access control is super powerful. Like you can do role-based access control as a subset of ABAC, and really, really granular policy enforcement. So I think that's actually a really good one too.
Agreed.
I know you only gave me 1, but I gave you 2.
Okay. I think we'll move on to questions. Anyone want to ask a question? We have a mic right at the back with Luke. So many.
What would the audience want to
Yes.
fix?
Right over there.
Hi, guys. I was wondering what is the most dangerous or scary threat in terms of cybersecurity threat that you see for your employees today?
I can take that one. I think it really depends on the business. So if you are a Facebook, you're hoarding a lot of user data, right? So the threats you face from the regions in the world is very different. If you're a media and entertainment company, that's very different as well. So I think risk grounded in business needs is the most important one. I think just being able to say this is the most absolute dangerous thing that we should worry about is really hard to say. Like simple things like S3 bucket leak got a lot of big companies in trouble, right? So that's why it depends.
I think I would add on like the supply chain risk. So at ICE, we write a lot of software. We're a technology company. And to your point, like I think you have to have the right risk profile for the threats you face. But basically, we're writing software for a lot of different things to solve for. And so if you look at Log4j and some of the other more recent events, like that stuff's pretty scary. And I don't think we've like actively solved it. Most of the CISOs I talk to, when the vulnerabilities come out, their first inclination is like, okay, well, where is it? So you hit the repos. And then you got to figure out, well, is it calling a vulnerable method? And if that's the case, okay, where is it deployed? And being able to do that at scale and at speed, I don't think we've solved that yet. And so I think a lot of the conversations this week have been around SBOM and other things like that. But that's one that I think we'll continue to we see pop up over and over again.
Thank you.
Or it's a vendor, and then you have a really tough time trying to figure out from the vendor how bad is it on their end, and how much time should you be spending, right? I think I will talk about one risk that's very contextual to Cloudflare because of the nature of our business. As some of you may know, 20%, or at least around 20% of the internet traffic is actually flowing through. Around 20% of the internet traffic is actually flowing through Cloudflare. So you can imagine what it would mean if you're able to coerce someone in the company to do something that you don't expect, right? So that's something that has been a risk that has concerned us as a company for a while, and we've invested very heavily to protect that for our staff. So Cloudflare, at least for me, was one of the first companies I've seen that has a 100% deployment of YubiKey FIDO technology. So the risks of things like phishing are largely mitigated because of that investment, right? And it took a while to get there, but you can clearly see the payoff now because at least we don't worry about that as much as possible, as much as we did in the past.
Okay. Any more questions? No. So I really want to thank Vladi and Luke from Lightspin, our partners here in this event, you lovely audience for spending the time with us, and of course all of you. Thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of RSA.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.